past and also at the present, there seems to be an antagonism somewhat between science and religion. Today we have an unusual person who belies this belief. For our speaker, Dr. William Pollard is both a physicist and a priest. He is executive director of the Oak Ridge Institute for Nuclear Studies, as well as a priest of the Episcopal Church. He earned a BA degree from the University of Tennessee and a PhD degree from Rice University. A number of colleges and universities have awarded him honorary degrees. The Doctor of Science from the University of the South, Doctor of Science from Ripon and Kalamazoo College, Doctor of Divinities from Hobart and Grinnell College, Doctor of Laws from the University of Chattanooga, and Doctor of Letters from Keuka College. He is the recipient of the Rice Semi-Centennial Medal of Honor for Distinction in Physics and the Distinguished Service Award of the Southern Association of Science and Industry. His memberships include Phi Beta Kappa, Sigma Psi, Phi Kappa Phi, Sigma Pi Sigma. He is a fellow of the American Physical Society and of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Pollard is a theoretical physicist and has done research in radioactivity, interaction between molecules and solid surfaces, gaseous diffusion, and neutron diffraction. He was research scientist at Columbia University on the Manhattan Project and thus had some part in the development of the atomic bomb. In 1954, Dr. Pollard became a priest of the Episcopal Church. He is serving as associate priest in the city of Oak Ridge and as priest in charge of a parochial mission in the neighboring city of Clinton. He has numerous publications, among which are the books The Hebrew Iliad, Chance and Providence, and Physicist and Christian. It is with a great deal of pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. William Pollard, who will speak on the topic Dark Ages in the 20th Century.
Dr. Hanwick and friends of Augsburg College, it's amazing when one thinks of it, the revolution which has taken place in our understanding of the world we inhabit just in the few years of this century. The extent to which science has opened up the world of the natural world for us, changed all of our notions about our place in it, given us some sense of the well-nigh unimaginable vastness of the whole of creation. So that now with radio telescopes we look out into space distances of 6 or 7 billion light years away from us. How all of this has come to be known through the remarkable adventure of the scientific examination of nature. How we know now a great deal about the substructure of matter through the sciences of chemistry and physics, about atoms and molecules and all the various ways in which they operate. And even down below that, into the substructure of atoms, of atomic nuclei, and even of the particles themselves now. All of this has come about just in the years of this century. It has been truly one of the golden ages of all human history. It has been a period in which man's knowledge and understanding has been opened in ways that are really quite unprecedented in human experience. It is certainly a glorious venture of the human spirit. the human imagination and the human intellect. This deep and wonderful understanding of the whole structure of the natural order of things. And yet, for all the wonder of it, perhaps because of the sheer enthusiasm for it, and the sheer and the remarkable opening of our imaginations and minds to a knowledge of nature which man never before had any access to, possibly because of that, we have lost something equally important that men of previous generations have naturally had and naturally held. And this loss, which is a very grievous loss indeed, and has the function of restricting our access to reality about us, about as severely as the great venture of science has opened up our access and understanding of the reality of the natural order. What we have lost is the capacity to respond in any meaningful way to those aspects of reality that are not within space and time. Those aspects of reality which are transcendent to the natural order, which are supernatural, therefore. Even the word supernatural has come to connote something that we ought to avoid. And yet, for all of human experience, up until the last century and a half, man has easily and naturally seen himself immersed in a reality which was simultaneously natural and supernatural. There was never any sharp boundary between them. There was a sense that the whole visible world of nature, of the natural order, was immersed in a larger reality, invisible and unseen, but alive and real, just as alive and real as the natural world. And this sense we have lost. And as I try to understand the difficulty of communicating the biblical understanding of reality and of man, of communicating the good news of God in Christ in this age, I have come more and more to realize that the basic difficulty is that people today do not have any natural or easy sense of supernatural reality, of any reality beyond space, time, and matter. That we're in a kind of intellectual and spiritual prison. That the natural order, which has been so vastly opened up by the enterprise of science, has become the only order for us. And we're caught in it and don't know how to get out of it. In order to see something of the point that I am trying to make, I've found it helpful to make use of a book published in the last century, a novel by an English mathematician that ought to stand along with Alice in Wonderland as one of the real treasures of that epoch. The title of the book is Flatland, and its author Edwin Abbott, and I strongly recommend it to you. It's in a paperback reprint put out by Dover Publications. that possibly you have already in your bookstore. I wouldn't be surprised, but it's easily obtainable. And it constitutes very delightful reading indeed. But Flatland helps us see how it could be that we have become prisoners of space and time and matter. Flatland is a two-dimensional universe, infinite in extent. To picture Flatland, one has to imagine a vast plain like this, like a wall going on and on in the vertical and horizontal directions. A vast, infinite, two-dimensional universe inhabited by two-dimensional beings who have width and breadth but no thickness. There is a whole populated world in Flatland about which this novel is concerned, and a whole social structure of Flatlanders. In a typical 19th century way, the lowest order in Flatland are the women, who are all very needle-like creatures, isosceles triangles very sharply pointed. And the lower male order, the lowest order among the males, are also isosceles triangles, but somewhat more opened up than the female version of Flatlanders. And as you move up the social scale, you reach the middle class when you get to equilateral triangles. These people are the middle class inhabitants of Flatland. And finally, the nobility, the highest order, are circles. Well, the story concerns the adventures of a Flatlander named Mr. Square. A. Square is his name. And A. Square inhabits, as other Flatlanders do, a pentagonal house. There is a gravitational field in Flatland, and it rains occasionally. And so the houses are all shaped like pentagons, with the roof part pointing upward, from which the two-dimensional raindrops, circular raindrops, fall. And the story opens one evening when the children have all gone to bed, and A. Square's wife is retired, and he's sitting in the living room smoking his two-dimensional pipe, which puts out two-dimensional smoke. And he's musing philosophically this evening on whether there might not exist something more than Flatland. All he can imagine is two dimensions, just as all we can imagine or visualize in any way is three dimensions. But Flatlanders, of course, can't imagine anything more than two dimensions. They can't imagine what it would be like to have thickness as well as width and breadth. But Mr. A. Square thinks that it might be conceivable that there would be portions of reality not confined to this two-dimensional realm. And he's musing on this when suddenly there appears a visitor right in the middle of the living room. And of course, Mr. Square can't tell how on earth he got into the house because all the doors were locked. The visitor is a circle. And it's a rather extraordinary circle because it grows and shrinks in size in the most remarkable manner and is quite capable of disappearing completely out of the living room and then reappearing again. Well, after his initial surprise is overcome, he starts engaging the visitor in conversation. And the visitor tells him that although he appears to be a circle, he's really much more than a circle. He's a spaceland object, a sphere. And that it's quite easy for him to enter or leave Flatland at will. All he has to do is move perpendicular to this plane. If he moves into it, wherever he intersects Flatland, all that the Flatlanders can see of him is his circular intersection with their domain of reality. And a very fascinating conversation ensues, at the end of which, having done all he could by words to try to persuade Mr. A Square that there is more than the two dimensions of his existence, the sphere takes him by the hand and pulls him right out of Flatland. It's a traumatic experience for Mr. Square, but he's just pulled perpendicular to Flatland out of his living room, and when he recovers his senses from this experience, he finds himself floating away from Flatland, and he can look down on Flatland, look right inside houses, and from his vantage point, and even inside people. He can see all the insides of things. He can see it all spread out below him, and he acquires from this the capacity to imagine in some sort of way the existence of more dimensions than his two-dimensional domain. When he returns from this journey and tries to share his experiences with his fellow Flatlanders, they decide that he's really quite psychotic and lock him up for the rest of his life in an asylum, and it's there that he writes the story Flatland. Well, that gives you some notion of it. The importance of Flatland is that it suggests to us very strongly the thought, well, what about our three-dimensional domain of reality? What is there so magic about three-dimensional space and the one dimension of time? Is this all that exists? Or could our whole three-dimensional space-time continuum float, as it were, be immersed in a much higher reality? Just as Flatland is immersed in space in a much higher reality than Flatland is. And this then makes it possible for us to conceive that the whole of nature, the whole of the natural scheme of things, all objects and events in three-dimensional space and time may be just a limited domain of reality, and that everywhere perpendicular to every point in space could stretch out other dimensions of the real, just as real as the natural world is, but inaccessible to our imagination or exploration, necessarily invisible to us because of our constitution and the particular limitations we assumed when we entered upon our existence in this world of space and time. This is one could say then that the supernatural domains of reality that have been so natural, so much a part of human experience throughout the whole range of human experience up until the last century or so, are, as it were, say, heaven, as men used to think of heaven, is up in the sky, up above us in ordinary space. And that if one went up far enough in an airplane, though they didn't have any airplanes to try it out, you'd leave the natural domain and enter a supernatural domain. We, of course, know that that is not the case. No matter how far you go out in a spaceship, you never get out of space. You're in the same natural order that you are here on the earth. And everything is of the same constitution, chemically and physically. And the laws of nature are much the same, wherever you go in space or time. But the supernatural domain of heaven could be a whole expanse of reality, in a sense perpendicular to space, rather than above us in ordinary space. Just as there were domains of reality perpendicular to Flatland. And if one could move perpendicular to space, one would leave it and enter a wider and freer mode of reality. In the same way with time, eternity has been the eternal significance of something which happens in time. How can one give this any content? Well, if one imagines that eternity is perpendicular to time, rather than just an indefinite extension along the line of time, then every moment in time has a reference to the eternal, in which eternal meanings of changing events and decisions in time could be caught up into it. So this little book, Flatland, can be a liberating experience. It is a way of opening up our imaginations to renew our access to dimensions of reality that our forefathers naturally had and naturally enjoyed. The world of Shakespeare only 3 centuries ago, is a very different world from our contemporary world. There, nature and supernature are in a very intimate and integral contact with each other. The sense of eternal meanings, of destiny, the sense of the limitation of the natural order is very clearly felt in the world of Shakespeare. But we've lost that. And it's a dreadful loss, really. It's an unnecessary imprisonment of our life within the rigid confines of the natural. One can see so many evidences of the way in which we've lost it. You can see it in a college education today, high school or college, the whole educational system, from first grade on up through graduate school. In every subject, every area that you study, not only in the sciences and engineering and technology, but in psychology, sociology, in history, in literature, in economics, in political science, in every aspect of human knowledge, I defy you to find any reference to reality external to or perpendicular to the natural order. Even the word supernatural is never, it is part of the dogmatism of our time that no reference to any supernatural influence or entity or existence is allowed to be made, that no explanation of anything that happens within space and time is to be allowed to depend on anything outside of space and time. You just check this and you'll see it's true. It's had a drastic effect on the arts, on poetry and art and music even. You see, I think very few of us realize that the first mode of communication that primitive man developed was not conceptual language, as we know language today. It was language, but the language of the arts, of painting and of sculpture. And as words and language developed, its first utilization was in poetry. And this is quite significant, because the whole primitive man's most vivid experience was an experience of supernatural reality, not of the natural reality. Was the experience of the beautiful and the holy, the inexpressible in conceptual terms. And so, since the greatest need that man had was to communicate with his fellow men his experience of the invisible and unseen world, of supernatural and transcendent reality, it was to the arts that he turned. And poetry and art has always been the natural vehicle by which men have shared with each other their common experience of transcendent reality. But what has happened in the 19th and 20th century? We still have plenty of art. We use art forms and we use poetry and the arts to communicate, but now no longer to communicate a commonly sensed external reality which is supernatural and invisible and the common property and heritage of us all. No, only now to communicate inner subjective feelings and experiences. Even a great artist today who deeply senses the reality of the unseen world he is trying to communicate through his art is foiled in this process because there is no common community of feeling to which he can speak. He speaks to a vacuum. All of the art critics will interpret his work as expressing only inner subjective states of feeling. Man has become, the 20th century is a century of complete solipsism with respect to anything outside of space and time, anything invisible and unseen. There is supposed to be no external reference in external reality to whatever experiences we feel when we speak of the holy or the beautiful. It must be something entirely within us. something that will disappear when we disappear, that will die with us when we die. Only our inner subjective feelings. That's the sickness of the art today. It has lost any external reference in external reality to communicate. There is sort of an allegory of this dark age, and it really is a dark age that we're in the 20th century. Recently, Mr. Khrushchev sent some emissaries out into ordinary space, much farther out into ordinary space than man had ever ventured before. He wanted them specifically to see whether there was any such thing as paradise or heaven and angels. And they came back, of course, and reported to him that they hadn't found any paradise or heaven or angels or anything of the kind. All they'd found was more space, just like we have right here. It was the same kind of world out there as it is down here. And Major Titov has gone around bearing witness to this failure to discover any transcendental mode of reality up there. Well, of course, this is kind of ridiculous. You can imagine a Flatlander Khrushchev learning how to make a two-dimensional spaceship and shoot it with a two-dimensional rocket way on up into Flatland, farther out than any Flatlander had ever ventured before, and they'd come back and say, well, it's just more Flatland up there. What Mr. Sphere could have told them was, if they really wanted to discover anything beyond Flatland, they'd have to shoot their rocket perpendicular to Flatland. And Mr. Khrushchev would have had to shot his spaceship perpendicular to three-dimensional space, so as to actually leave three-dimensional space if he wanted to discover heaven. But of course, none of his physicists and engineers know how to build a rocket that will move perpendicular to space and time. That's not a scientific problem. But there is an allegory to this, because just 1,000 years before, almost exactly 1,000 years before Mr. Khrushchev sent Major Titov and others up in their spaceships, another Russian ruler, the Emperor Vladimir of Kiev, sent an emissary out to discover heaven. They went to Constantinople, and they had the exalting experience of the divine liturgy as celebrated in the Greek Orthodox Church, in that remarkable church, the Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, which still stands in modern Istanbul, with its light and airy sense of lofty spaces, with the hauntingly beautiful singing of the choirs and the people, and the sense of holiness and wonder that surrounds the celebration of the divine liturgy and the Greek rite. Well, Vladimir's emissaries came back and reported to him that they felt they had been in heaven, and that nothing comparable to this could be found anywhere else on earth. That this was something so beautiful and so tremendous that it could scarcely be imagined without being experienced. And the result of their report, of having actually discovered heaven, was that Vladimir was baptized, and so was most of his court, and this was the beginning of the Russian Orthodox Church, which Mr. Khrushchev is so vigorously trying to eliminate now, having discovered in a different way that there isn't any such thing as heaven. Perhaps this sets the spot we're caught in. These two emissaries that went forth, and their very different way of looking for what they were looking for, sets the spot that we're in now. But it certainly is true that in a world and in a culture and in a society which is trapped within space and time and matter, which can't even conceive or imagine of anything really existing that isn't an object within space and time, how do we speak of the great Christian drama, of the gospel, the good news, in such a world? How can we speak meaningfully of the incarnation, of the Son of God coming down from heaven for us men and for our salvation and being made man, of the divine Word by whom all things were made, being made flesh and dwelling among us, coming into, entering our world from outside it, from realms of supernatural reality transcendent to it, from heaven, that is. How can we speak of the dramatic force of this astounding event in the whole of human history? How can we speak following the crucifixion with its intense, dramatic movement in power, speak of the wonderful victory which we have just celebrated, a victory over death? How can we speak of the resurrection of the Lord, of a rising to life out of death in a way which was very different from the kind of life he had in his incarnate existence, because the risen Lord could appear and disappear inside a room that was locked up. His resurrected body, though a very true body, a very definite object in space and time, was somehow not confined to space and time as our bodies are, and as his had been during his incarnate existence. There's the mystery and wonder of the resurrection, a breaking loose from the bars of our mortal material existence, a taking on of a mode of being that is just as real as the mode of being we now have, but not limited as ours is in our earthly pilgrimage. A sort of making manifest of the possibility of existence, not imprisoned as we sense ourselves to be in this particular limited mode of existence. And the story of Flatland has some very piercing things to say about the resurrection of Christ. But it becomes meaningless in a culture that can't imagine any way of rising from the dead that isn't simply a returning to this particular mode of three-dimensional space-time existence, nor the ascension of the Lord. Ascend where? Up in the sky like Major Titov or Colonel Glenn, just going up and up within space? No, the ascension of Christ was not that. It was a leaving of this space-time mode of existence, of his earthly existence. All of these great and meaning-filled events that are the news to which Christians down through the centuries have borne witness, with their wonderful power, their wonderful capacity to open up the meaning and destiny of life, the relationship in which we stand to our Creator and the nature of that Creator. All of these things become well nigh inaccessible to modern man because of the dark age in which we find ourselves. And when you have to live in a dark age, it's terribly difficult to break out. When it pervades the whole of culture, the whole educational process, everything that other people communicate to you in such an age, the only way to break out of a dark age is through the slow and difficult process of renaissance, of rediscovery, of a growing capacity of a few people to respond to the whole range of reality which the Dark Age has lost the capacity to respond to. If there's anything about myself as a scientist who has been touched with the capacity to wake up to and realize the searing and wonderful truth of the Christian faith, of the Christian drama, of the whole meaning of our Judeo-Christian heritage of Western civilization, if there's anything I feel about my peculiar role in this situation, is that I would have to describe the way it feels to be what I am, that it's like that I sense myself to be a Renaissance man in the midst of a dark age and at the early stages of the Renaissance, when what is so real and meaningful and potent to me, so many people seem not to have the capacity to respond to. What do? We tend to make all of the aspects of Christianity, every reference to heaven and eternity, a way of speaking, purely symbolic. We tend to make all of religion an inner subjective experience, a matter of the emotions and of our inner experience. And we devote a great deal of attention to religious experience, as though it's just a way of having a kind of jag, of experiencing something. But if our experience doesn't refer to anything outside ourselves that's real at all, it isn't much to cling to. It's the external. It's the reference in external reality, the living reality of the living Christ who exists and was indeed resurrected and ascended into heaven and lives now and is Lord of all creation and is just as real an existence as a nebula or a star or any other object that exists, is alive and real and exists wholly apart from whether we believe in him or not, or whether we experience anything when we think about him or not. And this is what I mean when I speak of the dark age of the 20th century. There's something very real about it. For all of the glorious wonder of science, and I wouldn't want to depreciate that at all, I wouldn't have missed living in this epoch of human history for anything. And having had the joy and the opportunity to be right in the middle of physics during such a glorious venture, of the human spirit. Science is the truly great thing of our age and time. But I can see now this secondary effect of it. This imprisoning of man that has become more and more severe generation after generation during the 19th and 20th centuries, without our realizing what was happening to us. This breeding out of us any capacity at all to respond in any meaningful way to any reality that isn't a part of space and time and matter. This is the dark age. This is the prison we're in. We're again a people, as the Bible spoke of, a people who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to whom the light of Christ came with illuminating power to release them from the prison and the darkness in which they found themselves. So I think indeed, in spite of all its glory and all its wonder, the 20th century is going to be seen in the retrospect of history 2 or 3 centuries from now, as it's looked back upon, as a real dark age from which humanity had to be liberated by a renaissance of rediscovery and refinding of the real existence of supernatural, transcendent reality and of the real meaning of eternity again. Thank you.
We want to thank you, Dr. Pollard, for your message to us today. Again, we want to invite all of you across the corridor for a short season of meeting with Dr. Pollard with some refreshments. The convocation is excused.